you very much, Frank and Tom, for a very engaging conversation. It's given us a lot of food for thought. My question goes on a little bit of a different tack. I haven't got the answer, but I want to raise a question with you. Isn't one of the factors which has led to the current level of economic stagnation the emphasis on cost control? When I say cost control, I mean in the form of shedding labor. And by shedding labor, of course, you shed income, and that causes the problem that Frank and you both mentioned, Tom. Many businesses are in the mature industry stage. These businesses compete by making products cheaper, controlling costs. They compete on price. Now, that's the problem. Businesses follow that. What can we do to get them to follow other things, such as making their products different and better that'll hire more people?
It's a good starting point, because it's true that at the level of the individual business, you make a profit by producing a good product, selling it at a price that's in excess of your costs. And you know, if you're struggling, you've therefore either got to find some means of advertising it more effectively so that you can increase your sales, or you've got to cut your costs, and often labour costs are the principal target there. But while that's true for the individual business person, it's not necessarily true for the economy as a whole, because if all employers are cutting costs, it then leaves the question, well, who's going to buy the products? In other words, if you're pushing down workers' wages, you're actually undermining the level of aggregate demand for the goods and services that are being produced, unless you're going to sell them internationally. And then, how much are you going to cut your costs in order to undercut wage rates in China, for example? I mean, there's no end to that process, other than some sort of global equilibrium in which capitalists are making more profits and workers are getting less wages. So it doesn't seem to me that that's the game you want to play, ultimately, even though, from the viewpoint of an individual small businessman in particular, or business person, then it has a certain sort of basic logic to it.
I'd just say a couple of things. The first is reiterating Frank's point about the difference between the macroeconomy and the economy from a business's point of view. And I had the opportunity of being involved in the recent minimum wage case of the Fair Work Commission. And it was very clear that businesses who are retail businesses, small, fish and chip shop owners, small clothing and other retail businesses whose customers are normal people who walk in from the street, they were pushing for lower minimum wages. And it was perfectly clear that they weren't thinking about the impact of that on their demand, on their businesses. They were just looking at it from their cost point of view. And in a sense you can understand, because this is an individual business owner. They have a set of things that they can control, and they have a set of things that they can't control. And of course they can't control the number of people who walk into the store and how much money they have in the pocket. But when they act on those things that they can control, they are indirectly contributing to the number of people and how much money they have in the pocket. And especially when their actions are coordinated across many, many, many businesses, and that's how they are. And so it's a common action problem in economics, and there's one of the things that you look at in public economics, but it's a very... Sorry?
They do in Germany.
Maybe. It's been a long time since I've been to Germany, but yeah, it's... The other thing that I'd mention is the point about economic growth. You cannot grow your economy based on cutting costs, cutting wages, or, you grow your economy. It is very, very well known. Economic growth, ultimately, long-run economic growth, comes from not what's under the ground, not what we can grow on the ground, but what's in between our ears, and that's it. Ideas, better products, better ways of making things, better quality, novel new things. If you think about what economic growth is, it's not just making more stuff or more of the same stuff. It is about making new things that are better and ergo worth more valuable. There's a quantity part of growth and there's a quality part of growth. And it's that quality part of growth that generates long-run economic growth. It's not the quantity. You know, and if you believe it's the quantity, then you have no option but to say we should not grow the economy because the world, the planet, is a finite thing. Right? If we think that economic growth is in any way sustainable, then it has to be the economic growth that comes from ideas and comes from our brains.
Could you give us a little bit of an explanation of Common Action?
Common Action was formed last year as a coming together of a number of organisations. Tom's on the group representing the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. I'm on it representing the Everett Foundation. Peter Murphy, sitting in the audience there, has been the convener of the group so far. There's unions, community groups, trying to come together to produce materials and hopefully develop a campaign around the principles that Tom has enunciated. So far, it's early days, but you know, it can't be that early. I mean, these are pressing problems, and given the political cycle, I think the next 6 months is going to be pretty crucial for getting this process some momentum, if it's going to have the impact that we originally intended.
It's an organic thing, right? It was just like-minded people getting together, agreeing that in the context, especially in the context that we face with a I don't think it's a stretch to say extremely ideological Liberal government, certainly at the time, where, you know, it's early days of, you know, the Turnbull government, but under Abbott, nobody can argue that that wasn't an extremely ideological government. You know, progressive groups, let alone progressive political parties, need to have an agenda that addresses the challenges, that addresses the fundamental problems that we see or that we believe exist in how economic policy is talked about, let alone implemented or designed, and that is able to engage the community and hopefully get some discussion and exposure, and ultimately to change politics. The Labor Party is the left party of government. If the Labor Party does not believe that a progressive economic agenda that's an alternative to the dominant economic agenda that we've seen for the last 30, 40 years is, you know, necessary from a policy societal point of view and politically feasible, then it's all, you know, much harder, shall we say.
Essentially criticising the government, embarrassing the Labor opposition into taking a bit more action and trying to mobilise community groups.
My name is Jason. I'm a member of the Australian Progressives political party. Thank you both for your talk, it's been really good. I guess for me, my frustration is that politicians are still talking to us and making everyone believe that a government's budget is the same as a household budget. And all of the conversations that come from that, and we end up stuck in this conversation about wanting to have a government surplus, which basically just means they're taking more tax than they need from us. So I'm not sure if either of you are aware, but modern monetary theory goes back to really first principles on a sovereign currency issuing government like Australia or the UK or the USA. So anything that's available in the economy in the Australian dollar can be purchased, so be it a basic income or a job guarantee. And the idea being that the real limits on the economy are not a surplus or a government deficit, but it's the actual resources available, the actual people's labour that's available in the economy, and the environment. If we have none of those, then it doesn't matter how much wealth we've accumulated in Australian dollars. You know, if we look at super, is my favourite example.
Question.
Yep, I just want to explain. So with superannuation, if we have trillions of dollars of superannuation and savings, but we have no environment, we have no educated workforce, we have no infrastructure, we have nothing to spend that money on. So basically the whole system collapses. So my question is, how can we get out of talking about government budgets like a household budget and get on with doing things, spending on productive things that people need?
I think there are some parallels between a government budget and a household budget. I mean, there's an income side and there's an expenditure side, and over the long term you want to make sure that they're broadly balanced. If your expenditure is greater than your income, you've probably got to go into debt, and that means you've got to make interest payments. Now that's perfectly sensible, like people borrow money in order to buy a home because they think that that's one of their social ambitions, so they can't pay for it out of their current income. So going into debt, incurring some interest charges, but ultimately being able to pay off is a sensible strategy. Just like a newly qualified carpenter, you know, can sensibly go into debt to buy some tools, buy a van so they can get around, get some work, they pay off the interest on their debt, and ultimately pay off the principal, and then all their revenue is in the pocket. So I think there are some parallels that can be drawn, but as Keynes emphasised, there's a lot more to national budgeting than to household budgeting. And indeed it's perfectly rational for governments to go into substantial debt over a considerable period of time, because after all, they're financing infrastructure that is going to be important for the next generation. In other words, their time horizon is ultimately infinite, environment permitting. So I think we don't have to go into the particular theory of so-called modern monetary theory to see some differences between household budgets and government budgets. And in the current circumstances, and I suppose this is my punchline, when interest rates are so low, it is perfectly rational for governments to be borrowing in order to undertake productive investment. They don't have, as in the case of the New South Wales government, to be selling off government-owned buildings in order to undertake expenditure on infrastructure. You can simply do it by borrowing at historically very low interest rates and engaging in productive investment that will more than handsomely pay off, generate more revenues, and in itself therefore help to bring budgets back into balance. There's nothing inherently beneficial about a budgetary surplus any more than a budgetary deficit. These are means to an end, and if the end is creating a more productive and fairer society, then frankly they can be used intelligently rather than according to some basic principles: surplus good, deficit bad. Nonsense. Let's get out of that straitjacket and think more creatively about fiscal policy, but without the need, I think, for any particular theoretical excursion into controversial notions of the form that so-called modern monetary theory offers.
I'd like to reiterate what Fred said. I think that's a very good summary. I have had a pet peeve with how we talk about budget surpluses for a long time. Budget surpluses are neither a measure of the skill or whatever of government's economic management, nor are they a reflection of the whole economy and how society is going. That's something that I can understand why a Liberal Party would try and make that case, that the government's budgets are like household budgets, and the government's budgets, a surplus reflects, it means that that government is an excellent economic manager and the economy is in good shape. I can understand why a Liberal Party would want to, have that be the predominant view in society. I don't think that that is what parties on the left should want society to think, because first of all, it's not true. Second of all, it doesn't actually help us to improve society or the economy or whatever. Government budgets, of course, have a lot in common with household or business budgets, but they have a few very big fundamental differences. Not only can governments print money, not only can governments borrow at lower interest rates than anybody else and more than anybody else, governments face a budget constraint in a sense the same as anybody. Whether I can borrow or not is simply a question of whether somebody is willing to lend to me and at what interest rate. That's the same constraint that governments face. Governments will not be able to borrow, to issue bonds, to fund anything with debt unless somebody is willing to borrow or to lend to them. And they will be willing to lend if they believe they will be paid back and in full. Australia, incidentally, has an equal best record on paying back government debt in full and on time. We have never even come close to defaulting, even when pretty much every other country in the world defaulted. We didn't. But that's sort of beside the point. So I actually agree that the way that we talk about government budgets, surpluses, deficits, and the rest of it needs to change. And part of that is recognising and talking about the actual function and the role of government. The government is not like a business in the sense that it's not there to maximise its profits. Surplus is not a profit. If the government wanted to maximise its profit or its surplus, it could simply commandeer the entire country and everything within it. It's a very simple solution, right? But it doesn't, because that's not what its actual role is. The government's just like a household. Households save for their own welfare, their own income, their own, for themselves. Governments spend, governments behave, the government's role in society is not about itself, it is about society. It's about all of us. When a government makes a decision to invest in A or not, it shouldn't look at the return that it's going to get from A. It should look at the social return that's going to go out into society from that investment. And it doesn't even have to be monetarised. Think about a public park. A public park is worth a lot of money. Just across the road there's a nice park. It's worth millions and millions of dollars, that land. You could sell it off, you could build whatever, and there would be a huge return, a financial return to the government from that. What you're missing is the utility, the well-being, the joy of everybody who uses that public park. And that is not a monetary value. That is, that's the point of life.
I went and saw Professor Stilwell, and I actually gave him the list of some of the books that I've been going through, okay? And essentially the point that seems to be, there are two problems that we actually have not addressed this evening. The first one is austerity, okay? Now, okay, we've just had quantitative easing, okay, to the tune of $12 trillion US, okay, bailing out the bankers, okay? Right, this is a public subsidy by taxpayers to the banking system and the finance system, all right? So now, what would you do as an alternative? Corbyn says that he's going to put quantitative easing in for the people, okay? And by the way, he's just appointed Piketty, all right, and Joseph Stiglitz to an economic council in London, all right? So I'm saying to you that what we need to look at is what is the actual government spending our money on? It says hasn't got enough of it, so it wants to tax us or screw us or whatever, and downwards, okay? I'm not talking about tax rises, the fiscal side of it. They're talking about the monetary side of things, okay? So that's my real essential question. What about dealing with the issue of inequality, okay, and instability?
The speakers agree, they've taken it as a comment.
Jeremy Corbyn, the new British Labour Party leader, has appointed Joseph Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty as his economic advisors. And the Greek ex-finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, feels that Jeremy Corbyn could be the Margaret Thatcher of the left. They could turn the tide on the neoliberalist agenda and economic rationalism that we've suffered from for the last 30 years. Do you agree? He also argues that the neoliberalist austerity model is class war of the 1% less against the rest, and the emphasis being on class war. So, Tom, you talk about the need for a conversation, but is a rational conversation sufficient given there are entrenched vested interests? There's an elite that actually benefits from this whole system. There's been a huge shift of wealth over the last 30 years from the many to the very few. Will that elite, that oligarchy, relinquish their power, their privileges, just through rational conversation? Or is there something more that's needed, like a radical revolutionary transformation? And also, you talk about the sovereign state is progressively being eroded by these transnational corporations. Isn't it time maybe to establish a new type of international? We had the first, the second, and even the third internationals of the past. So what steps is the labour movement taking to organise international struggles to combat the large transnational capital conglomerates?
Thanks. On the first part of the question, is Corbyn the Margaret Thatcher of the left? I would love to be able to answer that. Yes. I don't know enough about the chap personally. I do know that if he is to be the Margaret Thatcher of the left, he needs to be credible. His policies need to actually work in the real world. And you know, I'm open-minded. I don't know. I haven't read enough about what his policies actually are to make an informed assessment. But that's crucial. If that's not going to be there, then you know, it's just blowing smoke. You know, people's proverbial. Yeah.
I'll pick up on your sentiments about being polite. No, I don't think we have to be polite. The conversation doesn't have to be polite. It is about fundamental class interests, and ultimately the crunch will come. We can start polite, but this could turn ugly.
Corbyn bin Laden, as the Murdoch press calls him, or as the Channel 44 National Citizen right-wing civic council anti-global warming mob call him, the hero of the next of the uprising against capitalism, depending on which section of the fascist right you want to listen to. He, as you say, has to have something practical. And I admire this initiative you put up to try and force Shorten or whoever it is in the Labor Party through these flyers you put around to adopt a more progressive stance in the next Labor government, should we get one. But isn't this just reinventing the wheel after 30 years of Bob Gould standing here saying we can't desert the fucking Labor Party, and they sell us down from Carr to Keating to whoever. They've all been neoclassicalists whenever they've come into power. Sure, put pressure on them, get them to at least raise it. But my question from that goes to the second speaker. Where was the Metal Workers Union and the CFMEU when the big glue was going on over the destroying Cullen Bull National Park there, State Park in Lithgow, with the miners threatened that they're going to lose 300 or 400 jobs if they don't expand the mine and destroy the environment and the water supply for the whole of the Blue Mountains.
Thank you.
Why weren't you advocating solar power and everything else to give the coal miners the jobs? I've never seen a press release from the metal workers or the CFMEU jumping up and down when workers are being retrenched from the coal mining industry saying, give us solar power, government. That should be on your agenda shopping list on that sheet at least, or the union should be at least getting in the media whenever the workers have been fucking sold down the tube and losing their jobs.
The way that I've been speaking about these issues is how I think we, not just me, all of us, need to talk about them in the community. Maybe we're all very well versed in the theory of social welfare and private welfare and the rest of it, but I can tell you 99.999% of Australia's population is not. And they swallow that a surplus is good economy and that, you know, cutting wages is the way to grow the economy, right? All of those things are rubbish. We are probably much, much more educated than 99.99%. But
Tell us what the
Yeah.
metal workers are doing about promoting solar power.
So
On solar power, right, excuse me, Germany, okay.
I can tell you that the metalworkers certainly support renewable energy of all types. The metalworkers also support transition for not just coal miners, but people who work at Hazelwood or the rest of it. I can't answer you the question of where were the metalworkers when this and this happened. I probably wasn't even in the country when that happened. So I'll take that as a comment. But in terms of arguing for renewable energy, arguing for a sustainable economy, arguing for an economy that treats workers with respect, that gives workers a decent living wage, arguing for an economy that isn't just about increasing profits, but about increasing people's well-being, metalworkers and other unions are involved, and they are doing it, and in fact I have proof here. There's a list here at the back. Both the CFMEU and the metalworkers are on that list.
Thank you.
Just a brief comment on the ALP, because I don't think anyone's putting all their eggs in the ALP basket. I mean, in recent times the ALP has married a similar economic rationalism, or neoliberalism as you call it, with some sort of residual social goals about education, health and so on. They're trying to marry a hard-nosed right-wing economics with a sort of a social democratic social policy, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it's about time the Labour Party woke up to that. I think the Greens actually have woken up to that. They know that you can't do that, and they know, for example, when confronted with a particular issue like the closure or proposed closure of Port Kembla Steelworks, you've got to come in with an alternative plan. They've embraced a policy which says government should be putting the pressure on BlueScope to ensure that a 50% proportion of all government spending on infrastructure must be for domestically sourced steel products. In other words, that at least half of all steel going into infrastructure products must be Australian made. And they said for this purpose it may be necessary to take equity in the steel industry in order to leverage the industry not just to providing for Australian infrastructure, but also for reorienting its production processes on more sustainable principles. Now that's only just one small case, but I think it exemplifies a different way of thinking about how you can get involved in planning rather than just accepting capitalist priorities in a market economy. But we're a long way from seeing Labour leaders embrace anything of that thinking. Even on free trade agreements, for example, they preface every remark by saying, oh no, we want the free trade agreement, we're just a bit worried about Aussie workers' jobs, and so we want some different enabling legislation to provide those safeguards. For Christ's sake, what's so good about free trade agreements anyway, in the first place? Why is that an accepted fate? Free trade agreements almost invariably embody particular investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms which undermine democracy because they give corporations power to challenge government right to introduce environmental and social legislation that works against their interests. The fundamental principle is completely flawed, and Labour seems to have no recognition of the need to embrace that different way of thinking.
My question's brief, Gwen, and it's two, and one is, it's a conundrum. We criticize the market for being fraught with human imperfection and manipulation. But how do we know that the government will not be plagued by the same problems? And if you say, then give it to the market is what delivered us here in the first place. So did you get the question? How do you resolve that conundrum? The second conundrum is, how do you manage a democracy so that everyone manages to fight for his rights, but be aware that the government is not going to treat everyone like a baby in the same manner this mic has been managed for the past 2 years? Thank you.
Big questions. Certainly, governments aren't the panacea. I mean, in principle, of course, they're the vehicles for democracy, and democracy can impose limits on capitalist behaviours. But certainly in a representative democracy such as ours, the prospect of a political class essentially using that power in ways that don't serve the interests of the people is ever present. Corruption is the most obvious means of that. Corporate sponsorship of political parties, donations, all of the above. But it's a tough call to say, well, we have to have the perfect government before we can have the perfect policy. I think we'll be waiting forever. You know, somehow or other we have to work with our democratic institutions, imperfect as they are, with our political parties, imperfect as they are, to try to put pressure on them for more effective policy outcomes.
Well answered.
We've got point 8 down here. Companies and high-income earners must pay their fair share. Our tax system is skewed for high-income earners. Rebalance and make it fair. In regards to, for example, transnational corporations, how are you proposing to enforce that when there's no representative democracy at the international level? There's no democracy at the international level either.
Within the borders of Australia, we can do a lot. Obviously, we can't legislate for tax havens around the world, but we can find out and become aware of when a division of a company in a tax haven provides a loan to a division in a company in Australia that just happens to be equal to all its profits, and that profit gets siphoned off on a loan. Like that, the lack of ability of the Australian government or any national government to have jurisdiction over the whole world doesn't mean that they can't make substantial, improvements to. I think let's call it tax evasion, because it is tax evasion. Yeah, that's right. And in a sense, it gets back to the previous questioner's point about the vested interests in society, whether they be corporations or whoever else, are not going to sit and have a polite conversation like the type of thing that I was talking about. But I wasn't talking about them having that conversation. I was talking about us, ordinary people, workers, business owners, whoever, just ordinary people, people who do not represent a large vested interest. And we do live in a democracy. It's far from perfect, obviously. We can have some horrible outcomes through democratic processes that are corrupted to various degrees by vested interests, but there is a fundamental fact that we do live in a democracy. If the people do want a change of government or a particular type of government, the mechanisms are there. It's a question of being able to influence parties, being able, it's possible. I'm not saying it's easy, it's very hard. Right? And the final thing on the Labor Party that was touched on earlier, I'm an optimist, and I do think that they're moving a little bit further to a rational, progressive position. And you can see that in the latest National Conference. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll stick to all of those commitments that are in that, for example, a buffer rule. Right? That's in there. Are they going to actually implement a buffer rule? That's a hard ask. But it is progress to have the Labor Party even talk about a buffer rule as something that's on the table. And that is a small bit of progress, and maybe we would like it a lot faster, but it's not going to happen a lot faster without initiatives like this, without people like Frank, like myself, and like all of you pushing for these things and having these conversations. That's why it's important.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to show your appreciation to our two speakers. They're not only informative, but they did it in a very convincing way.